The next point is psychology. Psychology is deeply unholistic, reductionistic, and dysfunctional in its current state because it ignores spirituality and non-duality. It also ignores philosophy. It ignores the importance of metaphysical and epistemic and existential considerations when treating patients. That's why therapists, doing talk therapy, psychoanalysis, this sort of stuff, they tend to have very poor results with curing patients. And the reason that is because their patients usually have a deeper problem at the spiritual, existential level, at the epistemic, metaphysical level. And most psychologists are not trained for that stuff. In fact, they might consider those things to be nonsense and not genuine science, not real medicine. And so as a result, the therapist, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, he ends up having an understanding of human psychology and human behavior at a very surface level, because you cannot understand human behavior without deep spiritual work yourself personally, because all human behavior stems from ego, and ego is not just a psychological thing, it's a deeply existential metaphysical thing. So you can't cure someone with a serious psychological issue unless you're able to understand human psychology to its bone. And you can't understand human psychology to its bone unless you understand the ego. And you can't understand the ego unless you do spiritual work. So if you're a psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist who's not doing spiritual work, you're basically a hack. You're negligent at your work. And your patients suffer for it. Some of them kill themselves because you weren't able to help them. See? And of course, you yourself are psychologically sick, because you can't be psychologically healthy without understanding those things. So, and university doesn't teach these things. University only teaches a very narrow version of psychology that ignores all these other factors. In fact, speaking of psychology, about 70 years ago, there was a famous psychologist whose name was Skinner. He developed the Skinner box. Maybe you heard of him. And his whole attitude and worldview towards psychology was called behaviorism. His idea was that the internal moods and feelings and attitudes and beliefs of living beings, humans and animals, didn't matter at all. We can just treat the animal or the human as a black box. There's some inputs and there's some outputs. The inputs are the stimuli, like you shock an animal with a cattle prod, electrocute the animal, and then there's some sort of response. The animal screams, the animal runs away, the animal opens its eyes, sticks its tongue out, whatever. And so he said his whole approach to science and psychology was that we don't care about anything that's going on the inside. We don't care about consciousness, none of that stuff. We don't care about how it feels. All we care about is inputs and outputs. And all that science and psychology is, as a field, is the measuring of inputs and outputs, such that, like, you can give a piece of cheese to a rat, that's the input, and then the rat, eats it, and then it jumps up and down, and that's the output. And that's literally all that reality is. That's all that science is. By today, of course, the absurdity of this gross reductionism is very obvious even to many scientists and psychologists and academics. But even though the absurdity of that reductionism is so obvious, it's so limited, it's so extremely limited, this sort of reductionism is still happening all throughout academia and all throughout science in more subtle ways. A similar sort of reductionism was attempted within the field of logic and mathematics during the early 1900s. And this movement was called logicism. It was spearheaded by Gottlieb Frege and people like Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead and Hilbert and others. It was called like Hilbert's Project. Hilbert's project was to take all of mathematics and to formalize it into a simple algorithm such that every single mathematical truth and proof could be just churned out by a calculator. That was the project. It was the idea that mathematics is nothing more than the logic behind it and the shuffling of symbols, logical symbols, in a formalized sort of way. They tried to reduce all of mathematical truth to that, and they utterly failed, miserably failed. And then it took them about 30 years or so to ultimately realize that this is utterly impossible. And it was actually Gödel's incompleteness theorem that finally put the nail in the coffin of that. Also, Russell's paradox was also central to that. So Gottlob Frege wrote this whole book about how he was able to boil all of mathematics down to logic. He wrote this book. He was very proud. He was just about to publish it. He has some like brilliant proofs in there for his logic. It was all perfect. He's reduced it all down, reductionism. And then right before he publishes it, Bertrand Russell sends him a letter, short letter that contains Russell's paradox. I won't go into it here. It's kind of technical. You can go read about it on Wikipedia. But yeah, he gave this to Gottlob Frege, Russell's paradox, and then when Frege read this, his whole life's work just collapsed instantly. He spent his whole life developing the system. It all collapsed simply because he didn't consider the paradoxical nature of consciousness and of symbolic understanding. There was a similar movement around that time called the Vienna School, and it was called logical positivism. It was this idea that all of science can also just simply be boiled down to simple statements about true or false statements about the nature of reality. Like, is the sky blue? True or false? Is the sun hot? True or false? Is the snow white? True or false? And that's all that science was. That's all that reality was. That's all that truth was. And of course, it took them, 30 or so years to realize that doesn't work either. And so today, logical positivism is of course dismissed by serious academics and scientists because it's so ridiculously reductionistic, and ultimately self-contradictory and false. But at some point, some of the greatest philosophers in the world believed in this. See, so what does all of this have to do with holism? Well, I'm talking about the history of Western intellectual tradition and how deeply reductionistic it used to be and how badly that failed because reductionism fails. That's the whole problem of reductionism. It keeps failing. And the reason it keeps failing is because reality is a unity. If it's a unity, you can only understand it as a whole, not as bits and pieces. And even though I'm saying these things and serious scientists and academics and philosophers might understand everything I'm saying here, this is some technical stuff. Most laymen don't know any of these problems. But they still don't understand the depth of the problem. What I'm saying is that these problems still persist within modern science. This is not some sort of ancient stuff of idiots of the past century. This is all going on still today within science. Another example of which is how science ignores psychedelics, treating it as though it's an unscientific thing, as though psychedelics cannot be used to do much better science. And I don't just mean that science is not interested in studying psychedelics. There are more and more researchers and chemists and even psychologists who are studying psychedelics scientifically, but they're still doing it from a distance. They're not doing it personally. The real breakthrough will be when serious scientists start taking psychedelics themselves and using that to see the limitations of science. Now that will be true holism right there, but we're a long way from that. Within technology, we have a problem. In the technology field, a lot of ethics are ignored. A lot of technologies are just invented for the sake of inventing them for business purposes. So technology and business are closely related. But then the actual ethics of the technology are not taken seriously enough.